Football at 4, John McMullen. Our previews of the conferences of the divisions. The AFC West today is where we reside, as we have all of the previews up on our YouTube channel, the East, the North, the South, and today the AFC West with John McMullen. And this one here, John, could be home to 2 Super Bowl contenders, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's kind of a 2-horse race in the West. And I've talked about it before. I mean, I think the Chargers are the most talented team roster-wise in the NFL. And obviously the Chiefs are coming off a great season, MVP quarterback, so that's going to generate excitement. But you do have some question marks because we don't know what's going to happen with Tyreek Hill. Obviously, Kareem Hunt's already gone. So that's significant hits from an offensive perspective. I expect a little bit of a step back from the Chiefs, and if anything, a step forward from the Chargers. But when you say that, all of a sudden today, Melvin Gordon might not show up once out because they haven't given him a contract offer to his liking. So there's always curveballs in the NFL.
Yeah, that start with the Chargers in that situation kind of, because – it's like the running back spot, and I guess it was Michael Robinson, the old Penn State back, or I guess he was the quarterback, and then he became a fullback in the NFL. He tweeted out and basically said, hey, NFL, you got to pay running backs. They touch the ball on so many plays and so many varieties, but NFL doesn't see it that way. They see a bunch of guys who they can hand the ball to a bunch and find someone else who does it equally, if not better, quickly down the line.
Yeah, you're swimming in upstream. You're telling NFL teams to pay running backs. Mm-hmm. We talk about the devaluation of position, and people can point to outliers and say Ezekiel Elliott, what he means to the Cowboys, what he's meant to the Cowboys, maybe what Saquon Barkley will ultimately be, running backs like that. But the league as a whole, hey, this is what analytics is about, part of it, off the field. Sort of looking at values of particular positions, contracts. And they've made their decision, and they do not value that position. It's not debatable, and it's not changing because of what Michael Robinson says or somebody else. They don't value the position. They understand the short-term length of careers at that position. They understand what tons of touches do to players at that position. And as you said, Mike, you can find good, solid running backs. Maybe they're not Ezekiel Elliott, but you can find guys who can get you over the top later in the draft for far less money, and that's how teams are going about it. That's how the majority of teams in this league believe things at that position, and it's not changing.
Yeah, John, and this team here, this is, I don't want to say make or break, but they're running out of time with this group, right? Phillip Rivers, Keenan Allen, if Gordon's there, Hunter Henry off the injury. They got Mike Williams high in the draft a couple of years ago. This has got to be the small window opening right here for the Chargers, this year's team.
Yeah, I think the window's open, and you're right. I mean, just from the quarterback in that position and the age of Phillip Rivers, it's not going to be open forever. I don't think it's necessarily a one-year thing because they have assembled so much talent, and they could keep it going, I think, for longer than that. But nonetheless, I mean, you want to take advantage of every opportunity, and they have an opportunity. I don't think there's any question. I think New England's taken a step back without Rob Gronkowski. I just talked about Kansas City. If you have a significant suspension for Tyreek Hill, if they're forced to move on even, it looks like they're not going to. But you have no idea what's going to happen with that circumstance. You have to take advantage of these situations.
The 2 issues I see with Melvin Gordon, John, in what he's asking for is, one is that he's played in the league for 4 years, and I would say 3 of those 4 years he's underperformed. And I know fantasy-wise he scores a lot of touchdowns, he gets a lot of points, but first 3 years of his career, he doesn't even average 4 yards a carry. Not until last year when he averaged 5.1 did he actually have a good yards per carry average. So here's a guy who I think is a little bit overrated as far as, we are kind of re-entering an era of really good running backs with your Barkleys, your Ezekiel Elliott's, and he's good, but I don't see him as really, really good. And the second problem that I think he faces is the Chargers are really good, and they know that at the end of camp, teams like the Eagles even will release a Wendell Smallwood type player, or there'll be plenty of running backs that I think that they can make do with, and they could be one of those teams that signs Darren Sproles for a third down back. They can win without him. I don't see how much leverage he has. Yeah.
And that's the position. That's the concern. I mean, go back to the Super Bowl with the Eagles winning it. Who was the hero running back position?
There you go, Corey Clement.
In the Super Bowl. It was Corey Clement, who wasn't even drafted as a rookie, and he's the hero in the Super Bowl. So, I mean, that's an outlier as well. You would feel a lot more comfortable if you had Ezekiel Elliott, let's be honest. But it is a luxury, and you can win in different ways at that position. And I think guys get bad advice. I mean, we see it all the time. I saw again today where I forget the player, but he was complaining about Tobias Harris and the money he got as an NBA player. NFL players, by and large, get bad. I don't know if you want to call it advice or education, and the fact that the landscape is what it is. And when you talk about collective bargaining and you say, well, what's the split going to be? Is it going to be 47, 48, 49, 50, whatever? From that point, it's just about splitting up the money. And if you do have contracts where superstars get tons of money like they do in the NBA, well, guess who's getting less money? The pie isn't getting bigger. Right. You're just shoveling the deck shares. And a guy like Melvin Gordon, he's playing in a position that's devalued. And his agent, to be honest, should explain that to him. And you get the best deal possible.
Absolutely. I mean, the owners, they hang, and not that they say it, but they hang the threat of injury over every single NFL player and get them to sign contracts that are probably less than market value because, honestly, just like with the NBA and baseball, every NFL player theoretically should never sign a contract until he's about to become a free agent. That's how you make the most money.
Yeah.
But unfortunately in this sport, injuries are so prevalent, guys don't want to take that risk. And that gets hung up, unlike any other sport, that hangs over their head, that shroud of uncertainty so much that it forces them to have to settle for less money than they ordinarily would be worth a year or two down the road.
And I know we don't want to kind of get off on a crazy tangent here because we're looking at these teams, but the power has shifted in the NBA to the players, where they basically tell the owners, "I don't want to play here anymore. I want to be traded." And it doesn't seem that the NFL is anywhere near being able to do that.
Well, that's true, but I will say it's the same thing what I just said. You're talking about a few players. You're talking about superstar players, and when you do get to free agency, you're able to use an advantage, and certainly more so from the NBA's perspective, the superstars, because they don't have the franchise tag. But it's the same thing. There's still a salary cap in the NBA. It's basically 50-50, the revenue split. So that 50-50, that's not changing. No matter how big that contract is for that superstar player, that 50% number isn't changing. Mm-hmm. So the players as a whole are not making more money. More money's going to the superstars, and that's taking money away from the middle class of the league and the younger players in the league. If that part of it doesn't change, and it doesn't change in the NFL, and whether you take the franchise tag away, it's still not going to change. The money will go up to the superstars if they get the free agency, no question about that. But the pie doesn't change, and I think people don't understand that, to be honest.
John, real quick, the Chargers, Bosa, Mebane, they drafted Tillery, Ingram, Jatavius Brown, Desmond King, Casey Hayward, Darwin James. This might be, if not the best defense, one of the best defenses in the league.
Yeah, I mean, they're loaded. You got the edge rushers from both sides, and Joey Bosa and Melvin Ingram. Now you add Jerry Tillery, who I like. Brandon Mebane's a solid player. You talk about Derwin James. I think he might have been the best value of any first-round pick last year. He's a really good player. Perryman at linebacker. They bring over Thomas Davis even, who's aging, but we've all known what he can do. And then Casey Hayward. he's been one of the best cornerbacks, and for whatever reason, maybe West Coast, maybe people on the East Coast don't get to see him play that much. But they're just loaded. And from top to bottom, I don't think there's any question this is a top 5 talent team in this league. The only question is how high do you want to go? I'm going number 1. I think they're the most talented team in football.
All right, a team that might argue with you is Kansas City, and let's take a look at them. Andy Reid's crew, he's got Mahomes at quarterback, but they lost some guys, some big-name guys. Hunt's out. You don't know what's going on at the receiver spot now, so this is an offense that's going to have a little bit of a different look, especially at running back and possibly, at least for some games, at wide receiver.
Yeah, I mean, Damian Williams is not Kareem Hunt, but he did a solid job, and they have Carlos Hyde as well. So I think they'll cobble it together. We just talked about how that position's been devalued anyway, but you don't replace a Tyreek Hill. They drafted Mecole Hardman. It looks like they're going to dodge a bullet. I don't know if the suspension is going to be as significant as people think it's going to be. So from that standpoint, that's probably helpful. Travis Kelce, to me, is right there with George Kittle as the most explosive tight end in football. So that's huge. They're still going to be really good offensively. Andy Reid's as good as it gets when it comes to play calling, game planning, things of that nature. But defensively, I think is the difference. I don't think they're anywhere near Los Angeles, the Chargers, from a talent perspective on the defensive side of the ball. And although he's a friend of the show, and I hate to say this, not a big fan of Steve Spagnuolo.
Oh, no. Is John allowed back on the air after saying that?
I mean, 2 of the worst 5 defenses in the history of the NFL, are Steve Spagnuolo piloted defenses. Yeah, I think 2 of the top fair. 3.
He's done a pretty good job when he's had good talent, and specifically with the Giants. And they do have, when they have Chris Jones and Frank Clark out there, and I know they like Kalen Saunders, the kid they drafted. They kind of remade their secondary to bring in Tyrann Mathieu and drafted Thornhill, a safety that a lot of Eagles fans like. So I wonder if his transition won't be as bad, John, because he's got a pretty good base to work. Whenever you get Frank Clark,
well, I agree. It's not as bad talent-wise when he was having those issues with the Saints or the Giants.
Mm-hmm.
So there's more talent than that. There's no question about it. I don't think it's going to be historically bad. But I do think if you look at the great defensive coordinators or defensive minds in this league, even when talent wins in this league, we all know that. But it's about making the sum of the parts better than it is. And there's certain guys. One of them is here in this town right now, Jim Schwartz, is going to make it better than it looks. And he did it last year. I don't see Steve Spagnuolo doing that. I don't think he's ever done. I don't think he's going to start now. Will they be better than they were last year? Maybe. I mean, if you look at the shifts, they had big names on the edge last year, but they weren't effective in Justin Houston and Dee Ford all the time. So Frank Clark, to me, is a better player.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see if Alex Okafor can do something on the other side. I don't like the linebackers at all. And the secondary, it's okay. But I think they're going to have some issues still.
Is it basically to you, and I kind of see it the same way, is these are the 2 teams. It's going to be the L.A. and it's going to be Kansas City, and maybe whichever quarterback lifts his team the most. Because I still think that Mahomes can play like he did last year, they can be in any game and they can beat the Chargers.
Well, if Mahomes plays like he did last year, yeah, they're going to be great.
Yeah.
I'm assuming there's going to be somewhat of a market correction. I'm assuming he's not going to throw for 50 touchdowns.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'm wrong. If he does that, back-to-back 50 touchdowns, we might be already putting him in Canton, and rightfully so, perhaps. You just look at young quarterbacks in this league, and there tends to be adjustments, and there tends to be hiccups along the way.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's going to be really good. I'm not saying that, but I don't think it's going to be as good as last season. just because it's tough to do that. I mean, it's tough to have 50-50 years like that back to back, and it just doesn't work that way. So you also, and from the standpoint of whether Hill is there or not, I mean, if he's not there, I'm going to guarantee they're going to take a step back defensively, because he's what's so difficult about that offense. There's other great players. Kelsey's a great player, but let's be honest.
Right.
People are scared to death of Tyreek Hill, and that opens up so many other things for that offense.
Right. Hey, John, if Kansas City or Los Angeles was to not win the West, would Denver or Oakland have the best shot of overtaking them?
Well, that's a good question. I think neither. Anyway,
I was just about to say, you don't have to answer that, John. Don't make him make you choose.
Yeah. I mean, if you're asking me who's going to be in third place, I'm going to go with Oakland. I think
Denver does have a Super Bowl MVP playing quarterback.
Yeah, they do. But we all understand what that means.
That's like saying Oakland has a Super Bowl winning head coach, though. I mean, come on.
Yeah. And Denver has a new head coach in Vic Fangio. This is John Gruden's second year, and you see, look, he tore it down, and he got a lot of criticism for what he did. And maybe people were right, maybe they weren't right. But all of a sudden, you know, okay, if you have Antonio Brown now at wide receiver, who's better than Amari Cooper, if you believe in Cleveland Farrell, and obviously Mike Mayock does, you have a young edge rusher who's cost effective versus paying $5 million for an edge rusher. So that makes sense. And we just talked about running backs. They draft Josh Jacobs in the first round, so now they have him under contract for 5 years at a relatively cost-effective price, who could help Derek Carr. I don't believe in Derek Carr, but I don't think John Gruden believes in Derek Carr. But I do think the Raiders are heading in the right direction, and the Broncos are more of, we just haven't been able to figure out quarterbacks, so let's put a veteran in there and hope for the best. And I don't think that's a good plan.
I think they've got interesting talent, John. Like, for example, let's say the Oakland Raiders were coached by Andy Reid, because I do think a lot of the lack of high expectations for the Raiders have a lot to do with Gruden and him being a little bit of a dumpster fire and just trying to be the czar of that franchise. But if you said, hey, Andy Reid's going to coach an offense that's got Antonio Brown on one end, Tyrell Williams on the other, this great running back out of Alabama, Josh Jacobs, along with backing up by Richard and Doug Martin, and a good, accurate quarterback in Derek Carr, and a decent offensive line, although they do have some offensive line issues with Colton Miller and everything, but they signed Incognito. They've got Rodney Hudson. They signed Trent Brown from the Patriots and gave him a lot of money. I think people will be like, hey, that sounds – Andy Reid could do a lot with that offense. I bet you that team wins 10 games at least.
Yeah, and Andy probably could do a lot with that offense. And it's interesting, you know, with John Gruden, though, I mean, for years when he was in the booth, every fan base that had an opening, what's the first name they wanted? We want John Gruden. We want John Gruden. Then he finally comes back and he starts talking like he wants to turn football back into, you know, 1980s, 1990s football. Right. Which, hey, from an aesthetic standpoint, I wish he could get it done. I think that's a better game, but it is kind of antiquated. So I think people have turned on him, but I want to see what he does this year, because I see some of the moves I just explained. They were better than people thought. They made rash conclusions without waiting for the back end. And as I said, it looks terrible when you lose Khalil Mack and Amari Cooper, but then you don't wait for Antonio Brown and Cleveland Farrell and Josh Jacobs with the first round pick. So now you see the back end of it. It looks a heck of a lot better than it did before. But one thing I know about John Gruden, nobody falls out of love with quarterbacks quicker. Nobody falls in love quicker. Nobody falls out of love quicker. He's out of love with Derek Carr. He's not going to be the quarterback there past this season. I'm going to guarantee that. That's just the way John is. And I don't think he likes the quarterback, so I think that's a concern.
And then the funny part about that is you would think that a guy who didn't have any faith in his starting quarterback would try to find like a good backup on there, and you see that their backups are Mike Glennon and Nathan Peterman, and it's like, John, how much do you hate your quarterback?
Nate Peterman might be the worst quarterback in the history of the NFL. Yeah. I mean, numerically.
I mean, that might be the biggest indictment of Sean McDermott in Buffalo, because they started him on purpose, Nathan Peterman, on 2 occasions. So you have to question him at some point. But, I mean, Mike Glennon's not going to get you excited. Nathan Peterman's not going to get you excited. And neither is Derek Carr. So, I mean, ultimately, when the Raiders are in Las Vegas, none of those guys are going to be around.
That's our look at the AFC West with John McMullen. It's Football at 4, brought to you by First Bank of Seattle, Cape Bay's County's lending expert, banking for your everyday life at First Bank of Seattle. Find out how First Bank can simplify your banking needs. John, we'll do it again tomorrow, pal.
All right, thank you, guys.
Yeah, Football at 4 tomorrow, and John appeared via the Boardwalk Honda hotline.